Risk assessments are a really important part of what we do in managing health and safety in our workplaces. Although we do tend to overemphasise risk assessments and de-emphasise the reason we do them, which is to control the risk. Risk assessments are a means to an end, not an end. So we're going to talk about risk assessments, the legal context for them, as well as the moral and ethical context. My name's Steve Cowley. I'm a senior consultant at Finch Consulting, and I have a background as a generalist in occupational health and safety, as well as being an occupational hygienist. And I'm talking to Sue Dearden.
Yeah, I'm a health and safety lawyer.
With lots of experience of dealing with cases where risk assessment has been a factor.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I would say probably the vast majority of prosecutions where I'm defending involve in some way an allegation of a failure to adequately risk assess a situation. So it's really key to get this area right, if possible.
And it's difficult, isn't it?
Very difficult.
Getting the right balance.
Yeah.
Because we can invest such a lot of energy in writing extensive documents around a risk assessment, but it doesn't make us safe.
No, it doesn't. I mean, sometimes there are the risk assessments and people aren't aware of the risk assessments. You've got that as an issue. So the people on the ground who are supposed to be applying the controls in place aren't necessarily aware of the controls. Another common issue is that actually when there's a conviction, the risk assessment doesn't help because it hasn't really been thought through very specifically, and from a legal perspective it will identify a risk and all the time say, oh, there's a risk of death or there's a risk of life-changing injury, and then on the defence side, when I'm trying to argue that this issue ought to be sentenced on a lower level and saying there was only a small risk and there was only a risk of a minor injury, it's very difficult to argue that when the risk assessment is saying the complete opposite. So sometimes there is insufficient thought to a risk assessment. Sometimes there isn't a risk assessment at all.
I quite agree with you. That process that we go through from the identifying the hazard and then assessing the risk before moving to the risk control, it's got to be a continuous process. And the risk assessment is very much about estimating how likely it is something would happen and looking at how bad it might be if it does happen. And then we choose risk controls that are appropriate for those levels of risk. And we have to implement those controls. Otherwise, as you say, we're going to have, well, the risk is going to remain, and also we're exposed legally for our failure to address the risk we've identified.
Yeah, and the requirement is not that you have risk assessments and eliminate risk, though clearly if you can, that's the ideal, but that it's managed. So the risk is taken down to as low as is reasonably practicable.
Yeah, but I mean, there's some risk assessments we do. You know, if we put it in the legal context, there's some legislation that says you must do something.
Yes, the
pure regulations. And so we still do a risk assessment because it helps us identify the significance of the risk and the adequacy of the control. But at the end of the day, we have to control that risk. Whereas other hazards to be identified, we assess the risk and the legislation says so far as is reasonably practicable, we must control it. And that's what we do. And the risk assessment helps us make that judgment about what the appropriate level of risk control is. Sadly, in my experience, so often we'll see a huge amount of effort going into trying to quantify a risk. I'll come back to quantification. Trying to quantify a risk. And then there's a sort of token reference to, we train people to be safe. So often with manual handling risk assessments, there's no evidence that anyone's thought about higher level controls. And they've just said, we train people and we give them PPE. Not that I'm really aware of PPE that works in manual handling, but I was just looking at one yesterday where we train and we give PPE. We've got to show that we've thought about ways of eliminating the manual handling, ways of reducing the manual handling before.
If that's possible. It's not going to be possible in every case. Yeah. If it's possible. And what's reasonably practicable is a measure of When you talk about how high the risk is, there's sort of two axes to that, isn't there? There's likelihood of the risk materialising and how bad the risk is. Is it a risk of death or life-changing injuries, or is it a risk of a minor injury? And then you balance the likelihood and the level of harm against the cost of addressing the risk in terms of establishing what's reasonably practicable.
Yeah, that sort of leads us into, there is also a sort of ethical and moral strand to this as well, that
lawyers don't know morality.
From the health and safety professionals' point of view, we look at the moral and the ethical side of the argument that, okay, we've got a level of risk control here, but we could, without a great deal of expenditure, go a bit further and make it even safer. And so we should be considering that. We're not doing these risk assessments just to comply with the law. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do, which will benefit our employees and the bottom line in the business. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that.
So, Steve, you mentioned quantification in risk assessments. How would you go about quantifying risk?
Well, I think this is where a lot of people trip up. They become very reliant on putting numbers on risks, and often they'll use what probably a lot of people are familiar with, which is a sort of risk assessment matrix. It's basically a table.
Red, amber, green?
Yeah, a table with red, amber, green, and some numbers in the boxes.
Yeah.
And because there's numbers in the boxes, it implies accuracy. And people think that by getting a number and putting it next to a risk, it gives a measure of risk. But the numbers are dimensionless. They're just numbers. They just give you a relative value. And if you just do a Google of risk assessment matrices, several million come up in Google images, and they're all slightly different. They use different descriptors for the likelihood and different descriptors for the consequence. And they use, some are 3x3 tables, some are 4x4, some 5x5.
You've clearly Googled this.
Well, yes, it's a bit sad, really. I should get a life. But the problem is that people start to use those numbers to then decide whether they're going to do anything about the risk.
Yeah.
Now, whilst I agree that using these tables and the numbers can help you sort of decide what you're doing, I think the biggest role they play is in generating arguments. I think risk assessments should be done by 2-3 people, especially involving someone that does the job.
Well, there is a legal requirement to consult with your workforce in terms of working out what your health and safety controls are going to be. So that's sensible.
Yeah, bring them in, you'll get a better risk assessment, and then you'll have some constructive arguments about whether it's going to be high, medium, low, whether it's going to be 2, 3 or 4. To me, what the answer to that is much less important than the conversation, which in my experience leads very quickly onto, oh yeah, but if you did X, Y, Z, the risk will come down.
Yes.
And suddenly you've moved from a fairly meaningless discussion around whether it's 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 to, okay, it's worth doing something and we can do something and this is what we can do. So I don't like this idea of quantification of risk because you can't quantify it, not the occupational risks we're talking about. We need to talk about them in qualitative terms. It's a highly subjective process. People bring in a whole range of things that influence or bias their decisions regarding the risk score. But as long as we know that, through the discussion, we can get to the end point, which is reducing the risk for the benefit of the business. Yeah.
I particularly like the idea of involving the staff in a consultative way about the risk assessment process, because quite often with cases where a risk has not been identified and an employee has been injured, if they've been involved in the process themselves, it makes it very difficult for the prosecution to argue that you ought to have reasonably foreseen things that have occurred. Yeah. It's very easy to be critical with the benefit of hindsight when there's been an incident and to think you should have risk assessed or foreseen that. It's not always so easy from the opposite end of the telescope.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So when you do involve the people that do the work and work with the hazard all the time, it brings their insight and their knowledge. But quite often, especially people who are just doing day-to-day work, they're constantly thinking about how things could be improved, and that helps us get to the control stage.
There is a requirement that if you've got more than 5 employees, the risk assessments ought to be in writing. But something that often concerns me is that you will have a risk assessment for doing a task, and perhaps midway during the task something will change, something will alter, and then the staff will carry out a dynamic risk assessment of the new position, which isn't in writing, and then being able to establish that that was done. What would you suggest would be a way of controlling or managing that situation?
That's a really topical issue. Yeah, we have the risk assessment because we've got a maintenance task we regularly do. So we have a risk assessment, and then we could refer to that occasionally if we need to remind the staff what they're going to do. Normally, the risk assessment will form the basis of a safe operating procedure or standard operating procedure, which then becomes a guide for the worker to do that particular task. But then there's a one-off job that someone might be doing. Are we going to expect them to sit down and spend time doing the risk assessment? In many cases, the job just wouldn't get done. And also people that do a lot of remote working, for example, people going out to do grounds work in the parks and gardens, people going off to do maintenance work in the telecoms industry. Often they're encountering things which were just not expected.
Yes.
There's a phrase that's getting quite a lot of attention, which is the difference between work as imagined and work actually done, or work as actually done. And it's the problem of people sitting in head office writing a risk assessment, and then the worker gets out on site and something's quite different. The telegraph pole is actually in a great big puddle of water, which wasn't on the risk assessment.
Yes.
So you have these dynamic risk assessments, and we then get to the point where the person doing the dynamic risk assessment is meant to stop and write another little mini risk assessment. And they have little pocket books to write these. And inevitably, there's been some really good research done by a colleague of mine who he spent time going out riding sort of shotgun on some of these vehicles for some people going out and doing it was they went off and did sort of waterworks and pipe work maintenance out in the field, and they would have these dynamic risk assessment forms on the dashboard of their vehicle, and they'd all sit in the vehicle and go tick 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 tick, yeah. Right, now how are we going to do this job? And because the reality is they then examine it and work it out amongst themselves because they've been educated and empowered. They're actually better off doing a verbal dynamic risk assessment.
Yes.
But from a legal point of view, where's the record of that?
Well, I suppose you could have a record of the training on dynamic risk assessment, and that would help. And also the requirement, you mentioned stopping. If there's something different to the conditions anticipated by the risk assessment, if there's a trained requirement to stop, perhaps to consult with somebody in that circumstance so that you can be challenged and the dynamic risk assessment is done as a two-person thing rather than a one-person thing. That might be practical.
Yeah, and I think that is more likely to lead to safe work than a tick-a-box exercise on a little form that you do and then chuck it.
Yeah. It
just becomes I suppose, a way of counting performance back at head office. Oh yeah, the people out on the road, they've done 100 risk assessments this week, and that's seen as a positive performance measure. Whereas to me, it's what they've done to control the risk. So in closing, Sue, I think from my perspective as a health and safety professional, we want the risk assessments done. But we want them to be meaningful, useful, and provide clear direction towards the implementation.
Consultative.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and good risk controls, which, because there's been that consultation, the employees are going to be pleased to use and involved in using the risk controls that we've got. But from the legal perspective, there's obviously a strong incentive to have those risk assessments.
Yeah, I want paper trails as a lawyer, and paper trails of the training. So that people know how, it can be proved that people know how to respond to unforeseen situations, and training in dynamic risk assessment is also very useful.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Good. Well, thank you.